The Holy Gospel comes from the 7th chapter of Mark. Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know that he was there. Yet he could not escape notice, but a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs get under the table, eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home and found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by the way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ear, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said, "Be opened." And immediately his ears were opened. His tongue was released and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Christ. You may be seated. Years ago in my church office, I sat with a man who had lost his wife. His name was Walter, and he was heartbroken. I had invited him in to talk about his loss, about the grief journey, and to check in to make sure he had the support he needed. I remember the discomfort in the room that day. Walter, probably raised with the idea that men didn't cry and that tears were a sign of weakness, was trying to hold all this grief inside. I could see it in the way his chest quivered and how his breath caught in his throat and how he wouldn't look up to me, but kept his eyes on the ground. It seemed like it was someone trying to hold back the Hoover Dam from crashing down. I could tell he was uncomfortable, and his discomfort made me uncomfortable. I knew he'd want to run out of the room if he could, to his garage, to putsy on the project that he had been working on. And as I was feeling his discomfort, I wanted to run out of that room too. But I knew we had to sit there and feel these things, feel the grief and the hurt and the sadness, and just face them. That this was a way to healing. I wasn't naive enough to think that in that hour all would be made better. But I did trust that every tear that was shed in that hour, and in the day and the week and the months to come and the years to come, was a tear that led him down the stream towards healing. Our grief and our suffering is universal. It's what we share as a people. None of us escape that reality. And I know today that we show up here in this room and there on Zoom, all carrying some hurt that we need healing for. That our bodies or our minds or our souls are in need of God's healing touch. We all share that today. I'm afraid that we haven't always been taught helpful ways to deal with our grief or our suffering. We live by this myth of just pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps, which often, when we can't, ends up feeling like we've failed. That when we can't overcome an obstacle or can't control a situation, we can't pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, we can equate that as failure. But suffering is not failure. Another thing we do with the tough feelings is what Brene Brown calls comparative suffering. We compare our struggles to someone else's struggles and talk about how we don't have it as bad as that other person, so we should be okay. But in the end, we deny our truth and we deny ourselves compassion. And then if you take that a step further, we lose our empathy and compassion for others. But our suffering is real, our grief is real, and it is worthy of compassion. And finally, we're not good at sitting in those uncomfortable places of grief and loss. My storytelling trainer, Mark Yaconelli, says, if I were to name the suffering that exists in the West, it is ungrieved grief. It is an unwillingness to admit, to name, to embrace the pain of loss. And many destructive practices of the Western world can be traced to a desire to distract ourselves from grief, from what we're missing, from what we've lost. Sometimes I wonder if the madness of this moment is that we didn't do well coping with the losses associated with the pandemic. As a culture, we were so uncomfortable with suffering, we ran from it, we denied it, we didn't allow ourselves compassion for the little griefs, and so we didn't allow ourselves compassion for the big griefs. And when we couldn't face our own truths, that heartache and grief spewed out from us in unproductive ways, fighting and violence and digging in our heels more fiercely about these lines between us and them. Maybe this is all ungrieved grief that's led us down this path of destructive practices. And one of the few places I think left in our society where we can do grief together is church. Here we can feel all the feelings through our traditions and in a community that shows us love and support. For example, our tradition of the longest night service for years has given a space for grief and sadness in a season where all the expectations are that things should be merry and bright. And in this past year, we've offered several healing services so that we had space to be truthful about our suffering and our losses and our brokenness, and do it in a space of love, where we're loved by God and loved by one another. These are opportunities to present our full self before God and one another, our anger, our heartache, our exhaustion, our hopes, our disappointments, our pleas, our prayers, and to feel all the things and not to deny them. In this space, we need not put on a brave face. We need not pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. And we don't need to feel guilty for saying that something is hard. That truth can just be, that truth can just exist. Here before God, our fullest self is always welcome. And in our fullest self, in our woundedness and our brokenness, that is where we'll meet God. In our gospel story today, I love the tenacity of this Syrophoenician woman, almost the audacity that she has when she comes to Jesus. She is bold, she is fierce. I mean, there is nothing like a mama who is advocating for the life of a child. And she names her suffering before Jesus, and Jesus responds with an insult. Still, the woman demands that her suffering is seen. She demands mercy. She reminds Jesus that she is worthy of compassion. Now, I don't know why Jesus responds so harshly, and this can be really difficult to reconcile, but I like to think that the woman's faith changed Jesus. That in this moment, his own heart was opened to the outsider. And he could see, his eyes were open to see the wideness of God's mercy. In the next part of the story, as it goes on, a man whose death is brought to Jesus. And those who bring the man plead on his behalf because the man has no words to speak for himself. And they beg Jesus to do something. And Jesus, whose heart has just been opened itself, opens the man's ears, and the life is changed. Now, there are levels in this story where the healing is obvious, right? The demon is cast out of the daughter. But there's also healing that might have been hidden, or suffering that might have been hidden, like the suffering of the mother who had to stand by and stand as witness to see her daughter suffer. And I assume that she sought out other ways to have her daughter healed, and I assume that she was dismissed and discounted other times before. And for her, that healing was knowing her worth and claiming that worth, and then seeing her daughter set free. And for the man who was deaf and basically mute, there was that physical healing for him, but it was also a restoration to community. Because the suffering that might have been hidden was the loneliness and the isolation he felt, but with Jesus' healing touch, it restored him to community. God grants healing in many ways, in a sense of peace with what is, in the support and love of community, in the boldness of knowing our worth and that we are beloved, healing that comes in body and mind and spirit. When we do a healing service at Bethany, it's time for us to admit our suffering and what part of us longs to be healed and made whole. We bring ourselves before God and ask to be seen fully, even the suffering that remains hidden or the suffering we might be ashamed to admit. We ask for healing for the things that seem obvious, for the things that lie deep in our heart. We're invited to be honest about our deepest truths, not denying our heartache, not putting on a brave face, not feeling guilt for saying that a thing is hard. Because it's through feeling it that we're going to move down that stream towards healing. And it's in the truth that we're going to meet God. We'll meet God in that place that we're most afraid to look. at our suffering and the wounded, lonely, frightened place within ourselves. God will meet us there. So the gift of healing we receive today is that God is with us always, and God is with us particularly in the grief and in the sorrow and in our suffering. We never walk this path alone. Even though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, God is with us. As a reminder of this promise, we're going to move right into the laying on of hands part of our service, but because of COVID, we're going to do it a little bit differently today. I invite you to take your hand and lay it on your heart. And call to mind that thing for which you need healing, or for the many things for which you need healing. And be compassionate towards yourself and towards that heartache. Hold it with care. Hold it with love. And now hear these words of blessing. You are known and loved by a God who created you, by the one who accompanies you in your joy and in your sorrow, with the promise of life after death. May you be strengthened by the love of this community and the healing power of the Holy Spirit, now and forever. And you can keep your hands there on your heart. God, you are the source of all healing. Thank you for coming near the broken and despairing parts of life, even seeking them out. And though we have felt lost and forsaken, we remember the cross and trust that your loving presence knows every inch of our human story. Send us with your Spirit for company, like wind that whispers tender and fierce love into our courage and hope each day. Amen.